All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. This is a channel where we check out great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, uh, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries, mostly emanating from obscure sources. And we've been doing a lot of Bible decodes, certainly not an obscure source, but an obscure way to look at the Bible is not going to be very obscure very soon, because it is a theory that seems to answer all comers. It's a pretty airtight theory, more so than just about anything I've seen, and that is the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament of the Bible. This is Bible Decode 206. And we've been focusing on various aspects of this Roman origins hypothesis. That the New Testament was written really entirely by the Roman Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, that is, Emperors Vespasian and his two sons Titus and Domitian, that ruled Rome from 69 until 96 AD. They wrote the Gospels, backdated them by 40 years. At the same time, they wrote a work of history of a war that the Romans got into with the Jews right before this, and that Titus and Vespasian were two of the generals in the war. And that is called War of the Jews, and is written under the name of Josephus. These two books are intended to be read together. They are paralleling each other and parodying each other, and paraboling each other all throughout. Michael Menescot's found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. Joseph Atwill found a series of 45 consecutive events where the military campaign of Titus is mirrored by the ministry of Jesus. Every place that they go, one goes, the other also goes in the same order. And they experience parallel events that are shifted by 40 years to the day, sometimes to the hour. And this is a long series of events that Atwill documents in his book, Caesar's Messiah. There are many more books on this subject. The Romans had a motive, which was to mellow out the Jews, who had been very, very militant and resistant to the Roman occupation there for over 130 years. This is exactly what the Romans would do. They created a number of other religions in the first century for psychological operation purposes, psychological warfare against a certain group of people. And they were the only people who could have even done it, because they had a monopoly throughout the empire on censorship, publishing, and distribution. The works also came out in Greek, indicating by far a more likely source would be the Romans, who all spoke Greek, as well as the elites speaking Latin, whereas in Judea, the apostles of Jesus would have been speaking in Aramaic, and possibly a few of them might have had some Greek. And none of them were able to write also. So the parallels go way, way, way beyond that. But we have documented these all in the previous videos. But we are now looking at a book that is called Operation Messiah, written by Rosemary Sheldon and Thais Voskelin. And they really are getting the gist of the Roman origins hypothesis, that Jesus is completely deferential to the Romans, and that Paul is even more so, and that they both are really and when they do make negative comments, it's against the Jews and not the Romans, and many other hints that this was written by the Romans. But they don't make that final leap, that kind of comprehensive leap. Instead, they stay with kind of a more narrow approach of saying that Paul was an intelligence agent of the Romans. So Paul was part of the Operation Messiah, which is really just trying to spy and surveil Jesus and his band. A few more steps, and they could have gotten to the Roman origins hypothesis. So we're kind of looking at this in light of what they could have seen otherwise, and also seeing if we can get some tidbits from this that apply also. Okay, we're in chapter 1, and this section is called Jewish Reaction. And he's talking about Pontius Pilate and the crucifixion in general, I believe, at this point. Pilate was no administrative neophyte when Jesus was brought before him, and his previous actions in Judea had created a crescendo of Jewish reaction, including mass civil disobedience, active rioting, diplomatic intervention by letter to Rome, and finally an embassy to the emperor himself to plead the Jewish case. Pilate would not have been intimidated by a Jewish mob. In at least one instance, his undercover agents mingled with a crowd and provoked them to riot in order to provide an excuse to cut them down. Pilate knew all. Now again, he has a citation here, number 73. When we get down to the footnotes, we'll take a look at who this is. But, these citations, what you have to understand really about the Roman origins hypothesis is its all-encompassing nature. Not only did the Romans write the New Testament so that the New Testament is fiction and cannot be trusted, at face value, but it also means that the works of Josephus, the primary historian of the entire first century in the Roman Empire, is also fiction, or at least partially fiction, or at least not trustworthy. And it cast a lot of shade on a number of other documents that were written during this time, and even before, a couple centuries before, and even a half century after. This was a long campaign by the Romans. They spent maybe 50 years putting together all the different books of the New Testament. And according to some authors, they wrote all the Apocrypha as well, and they wrote all of the works of the Church Fathers, such as Saint Ignatius, Origen, and Tertullian. All of these guys are. They wrote them to make it appear as if Christianity was kind of succeeding, and that it was an issue for people during during the second and third centuries, and I think even later than that, because all of the people that were involved, these Flavian emperors and their offshoots, they became eventually all of their family members became popes. So it's not like the Roman Empire died. The Roman Empire just morphed into the Roman Church. And, that lasted for, another 1,000 years plus. So, depending on how you, if you consider the move to Byzantium and everything. Okay. Pilate knew the ways of both violence and subterfuge. He was, after all, regionally responsible for the world's most efficient fighting machine, the Roman army. We will never know the exact intelligence upon which he based his decisions, but we may speculate that it did not take much to move him once the possibility of sedition had arisen. As a Roman prefect, Pilate, and only Pilate, had the legal authority to inflict the Roman penalty of crucifixion in Judea. Jesus was crucified under Roman law by a distinctly Roman form of punishment, even though the Romans did not invent the technique. The evidence, primarily from Josephus' accounts, appears conclusive that from the beginning of Roman rule in 63 BC until shortly before the outbreak of Jewish war in 66 AD, in Palestine, only insurgents, or those who passed for insurgents, I guess. There's a typo here. Or were in sympathy with insurgents, were executed by crucifixion. That is to say, crucifixion was not just capital punishment, but a cut by Roman authorities. No, I'm sorry, I skipped a line. But a political punishment for a political offense. It was always carried out by Roman authorities, not Jewish officials. It was a form of Roman imperial terrorism, done always as publicly as possible to deter others from the same path. In all probability, Pilate received Caiaphas, the high priest's charge, had Jesus flogged and briefly interrogated, and when answers were not forthcoming, had Jesus sent to the cross without a second thought. This evidence agrees with the sequence of events narrated by the Gospels. Jesus appeared before Pilate and was executed almost immediately with no further witnesses or due process. For this kind of trial, the regular accusation made by the plaintiff was unnecessary. The mere information of a, this is a Roman word that is delator, an informer. The mere information of an informer sufficed, and even that was unnecessary if Pontius Pilate's intelligent network possessed sufficient knowledge of an action or plot. The offense of rebellion was a crime extraordinaria, crimen extraordinaria, and when it included armed participants, this only aggravated the circumstances. The mere formation of right assemblies, coitus nocturni, such as Jesus' meeting with his followers on the Mount of Olives, was a crime in and of itself. Such offenses could carry a death sentence, and the punishment was left in the hands of a governor. The story of Pilate's reluctance and weakness of will are best understood as subsequently produced Christian propaganda. I would argue that it's more like contemporaneously produced Christian propaganda from the Romans. Either way, they are a kind of excuse for Pilate's action, which reduces the conflict between the Christian movement and Roman authority. How much Jesus was affected by the revolutionary currents of his time will never be known, but his death certainly resembled that of a Jewish nationalist, a rebel against Rome See, I wish they would be able to cite me at least one thing that Jesus does against Rome. The only thing that he does is he causes some chaos, which the Romans don't like because, they have to govern. And so it's a pain for the Romans, but he doesn't do anything anti-Roman like a Jewish nationalist would. He's just the chaos agent of the Jews. Not even of the Romans, but the Romans feel it because they're the ultimate, ultimately in charge there. If you believe any of this, because all of it is fiction anyway. A rebel against Rome was a rebel against Rome, however much he cloaked his rebellion in talk of a God. Such a rebel belonged on the cross, not in the hills of Galilee or on the streets of Jerusalem, and certainly not in the precincts of the temple. Jesus' public agony, his helplessness, and ultimately his failure would discourage other charismatics from dreaming dangerous dreams. It would discourage the populace from following would-be king messiahs, who were, in Roman eyes, the deluded weavers of a fantasy kingdom of a God that would never come. That's also, the Roman origins hypothesis would really help them here. Because Titus is written into Josephus as the second coming of Jesus. So it's not deluded weavers of a fantasy kingdom of a God that would never come. It is that they use the Gospels to graft themselves into the situation of a God that would come. The God that would come is Roman. All the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled by Titus in the War of the Jews, including the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, not leaving two stones together or whatever he says. That's exactly what Titus does, and that, according to Jesus in that prophecy, is the sign of my second coming. So it's not a God that would never come. It's a God that when he does come, he's Roman. For Pontius Pilate, a charismatic turned over by the loyal and competent Caiaphas, would have been a welcome opportunity for a display of Caesar's might. All four Gospels report that the inscription on the cross in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew was the phrase, "the King of the Jews." The titulus was a Roman method of publishing the reason for the execution, so that everyone would know why the victim was so punished. Both the penalty of crucifixion and the written public announcement would indicate to all spectators that Jesus was put to death for a political reason. The primary responsibility for Jesus' death lay clearly with the Romans. They were the true masters of the situation. The discrepancies in the Gospels and the widespread prevalence of the depoliticized version of the story, familiar to most of us, may be accounted for by looking at the world in which Gospel writers had to survive during the 1st century CE. The earliest Gospel is Mark's, which was written after the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. The Romans had just put down a massive insurrection by the Jews, and they were hardly in the mood to tolerate the followers of another insurrectionist whom they had already executed. There was no obscuring the fact that Jesus has been executed as a king of the revolutionary type. In mockery, Jesus had been arrayed in regal robes during his trial, and a crown, albeit of thorns, had been placed on his head. He had been mocked as a king, both by the procurator's troops and by the crowd at the crucifixion. The gospel writers were anxious to exonerate Jesus of the accusation of having been a revolutionary, with the consequence that they presented him as a king devoid of all political meaning. Much more than Mark, the later synoptic gospels show many signs of a desire to erase from the record of Jesus' life any suspicion that he had been a pretender king of the type common in his day. They stress Jesus' pacifistic program. Jesus taught his followers to turn the other cheek to their enemies and to meet their unjust demands with more than what was asked, like walking the extra mile. They were to love their enemies, do good to them, and pray for those who persecuted them. As we shall see later, many of these themes were lifted from persecutor Paul's letters. Even with this attempt to soften the picture, the truth emerges. The synoptic gospels contain the elements of a correct version of the procedure in a Roman provincial trial. All four gospels agree that the political charge was either a primary or the sole charge before Pilate. It is only the non-synoptic version of John that tries to insert a theological charge as well. John's narrative seems to be a conscious literary reconstruction, and only in this latest gospel is found the elusive and inexplicit account of the sessions of the Sanhedrin, where the Jews brought Jesus before Pilate to sanction his execution for an offense against religious law. This is presented as an alternative to the political charge that Pilate seems to reject. The gospel writers thus took their material and used it not to write history, but to write a religious tract. We can still detect a core of possibly historical material concealed in this attempt at reinterpretation. Paul and the evangelists, especially John, elevated Jesus above attack by obscuring almost completely the man of Galilee and setting forth the Jesus of Christian doctrine. It's interesting, and I think that's probably accurate, but if you think about it in terms of the Romans doing all the writing here, they put together the book of Mark, and then they figured out that maybe they could soften up Jesus with some pacifism and some turning the other cheek and so on, and some compliance with the Roman government, and so then they put out Matthew. And then they figured out they could do it even a little bit better, and so then they put out Luke. So, I think it's just that the Roman origin hypothesis has better explanatory power than all of these other theories, which are kind of like pastiches or something, where they kind of put different pieces together and they almost fit together, but there's always a few anomalies around the edges or whatever. The Roman origin hypothesis is just like a big blanket that you can lay over everything, and then it explains everything. Okay, this section is called Intelligence and Political Decisions. We now return to our original questions. Who was Jesus? What did he actually do? And how did the Romans find out about these events and interpret them? What was in the Jesus file? We certainly cannot write anything like a detailed intelligence report in the modern sense of a figure who is seen so fitfully and through so strange a lens as the Christian scriptures by concentrating on the intelligence needs of the Romans. We can discern the outline of a case that attracted the attention of the Roman authorities and presented a security risk. Rome's immediate intelligence sources are clear. The priestly leaders of Jerusalem and Roman army personnel. What other undercover sources they may have used will remain unknown, as such intelligence resources often do. An examination of Jesus' career as filtered through the eyes of the Roman administration shows that the intelligence they received caused the Romans to have Jesus arrested and executed. There will probably always be a dispute about the significance of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, the cleansing of the temple, the disciples' swords, and the arrest of Jesus, the Barabbas episode, and the trial or trials. No consensus is ever likely to be reached based on the available evidence until you recognize that it's complete fiction and that all of it can be easily explained by the Roman origins hypothesis. It's basically the same as just saying there is no Santa Claus. You know, we can pretend that Santa, you know, just left the North Pole and somehow he's going to go down like how many billion chimneys tonight, even though he's really fat. And, you know, we can come up with reasons why that would be true. You know, like, look, the weatherman on the news told me that Santa has been spotted by radar, you know, leaving the North Pole. He's on his way, you know. This book told me that Santa is real, and so did my parents. But how do you explain all the rest of it? Well, eventually you get to the level of maturity where you're like, you know, actually this whole thing is BS, and you move on with your life. But no consensus is ever likely to be reached. Now, I disagree with that. I think there will be a consensus reached when it becomes obvious, when more people are aware of the Roman origins hypothesis, and they're like, yeah, this story is absurd. It's the same as every other story that we read that we classified as mythology or fiction. And, you know, it may have been based on a real person, but, you know, this is fiction. But the attitude of Jesus to the temple, as well as his sayings concerning social injustice, had to bring him sooner or later into conflict with the authorities, whose task it was to maintain order, and to whom any national movement appeared suspicious. Even apart from the content of any message from Jesus that subverted Roman law and order, the very presence of enthusiastic crowds listening to whatever it was said, whatever it was he said, would have been deemed dangerous at any time, no matter how nonviolent Jesus was. This was especially true at Passover. Later still, we see in Acts that the Romans were more than willing to use violence against Paul when they allegedly suspected him of stirring up crowds. Jesus was probably being watched from the very beginning of his public career. The knowledge that somebody had proclaimed king in Galilee, had been proclaimed king in Galilee at a huge gathering in the wilderness, must have reached the ears of the Romans. John the Baptist, after all, had been killed for less. Witnesses may have included individuals willing to sell the information to the Romans or Roman agents themselves. Then they heard through the Jewish authorities or paid informants that Jesus the king of the Jews, had reached Jerusalem, and that there had been a symbolic assertion of his kingship when Jesus rode into the city at the beginning of the week on a donkey. Jesus created this disturbance when he turned over the money changers' tables in the temple. Reports by various agents were probably confused, as happens with all raw intelligence. We must not overlook the possibility that the agents exaggerated their accounts to make themselves look more important or efficient. Some of the intelligence may have seemed useful, some of it not. And we are left completely in the dark as to how such intelligence was collated and analyzed. In the case of Paul, one warning from his nephew seems to have been enough for the Romans to immediately employ a vast number of troops to protect him. The impression is created that it did not take a lot for the Romans to see an emergency situation arising in Jerusalem, and that they sometimes took drastic action based on hearsay alone. If Pilate had informers within the Jewish community, they would have told him that Jesus had quarreled with the scribes and Pharisees about the questions of ritual observance. Such news would hardly have interested Pilate, since the Jews were always quarreling among themselves about religious questions which to an outsider were wholly obscure. But the question of resistance to the state, I'm just going to go back here. I think that's not quite accurate. I think that the Jews, quarreling about, obscure interpretations of Scripture and so on, what he's just saying there, that was really brought into the Jews by rabbinic Judaism that started right here at the same time as Christianity. And I don't think it was quite as big of a deal before. And that's what ends up with things called the Talmud, where they're and this pesher technique that is not as pronounced in the Old Testament scriptures. Anyway, that's quibbling. But the question of resistance to the state would not have been ignored. No doubt some versions of his miracles were circulating and had been picked up by Roman agents, but this might have led to the charge that he practiced magic. Likewise, the Romans had detected some talk of his kingship. The Gospel of John at 6:15 says Jesus himself was afraid that the people might try to force him to become king. Even if this was what he least wanted, intelligence